If you go looking for Plymouth Rock today, you might be a little underwhelmed. It's not a giant cliff or a majestic mountain. It's a rather ordinary-looking granite boulder, sitting quietly in Plymouth, Massachusetts. It rests on the shore of Plymouth Harbor, protected from the elements and enthusiastic tourists by a grand columned canopy called the Pilgrim Memorial State Park Portico. The rock itself isn't very big, maybe about the size of a large coffee table that has seen better days. It has the year 1620 carved into its surface, a permanent reminder of the year a small ship full of hopeful, and probably very tired, people arrived here from England. The rock has a famous crack running right down its middle, a scar from its long and complicated history which we'll get into. It's a piece of history that looks less like a monument and more like a geological patient in a very fancy hospital bed. This humble rock is treated with a reverence that seems almost comical, given its size. It sits in a sandy pit, surrounded by a metal fence, ensuring no one can touch it, chip off a souvenir, or try to reenact the famous landing. The whole setup is very official, very serious. You look down at it, this gray weathered stone, and you have to use your imagination to picture the scene it's meant to represent. You have to imagine the cold November air, the smell of the sea, and the sight of the Mayflower anchored in the distance. The rock itself doesn't scream epic historical event. It whispers it, and you have to lean in close, past the fence and the other tourists to even hear it. It's a testament to how symbols work. We pour meaning into objects, turning a simple stone into the foundation of a nation's story, whether it deserves that honor or not. The park surrounding the rock is a popular destination. People from all over the world come to see it. They stand at the railing, take pictures, and listen to guides tell the story of the Pilgrims. Nearby, a replica of the Mayflower called the Mayflower II is often docked, giving visitors a better sense of the tiny, cramped vessel that carried the colonists across the Atlantic. The whole area is a sort of living museum dedicated to a single moment in 1620. The rock is the star of the show, the main attraction. It's the starting point, the literal and figurative ground zero for the story of the Pilgrims in America. It's a tourist trap for sure, but it's also a place that makes people think about beginnings, about journeys, and about how a country's most powerful myths can be tied to something so small and so solid. Despite its fame, the rock's appearance often surprises people. They expect something grander, something more obviously historic. But its ordinariness is part of its charm and its power. It reminds us that history isn't always made in grand palaces or on dramatic battlefields. Sometimes it's made on a cold, windswept beach by a group of people just trying to find a safe place to land. The rock is a physical link, however tenuous to that moment. It's a piece of the original landscape, a silent witness that has survived for centuries. Its protected status under the ornate canopy shows just how important this little piece of granite has become to the American identity, a cornerstone of the national narrative that we've built, piece by piece, over hundreds of years. So, who are these people we call the Pilgrims? They weren't just a random group of adventurers looking for gold or glory. They were, for the most part, a group of religious separatists. This means they wanted to separate from the official Church of England. Back in early 17th century England, the king was the head of the church and everyone was expected to follow its rules and rituals. The Pilgrims, however, had their own ideas about how to worship God. They believed the Church of England was too corrupt and too much like the Catholic Church it had broken away from. They wanted a simpler, purer form of faith. This was a dangerous idea at the time. To defy the king's church was to defy the king himself, which could lead to persecution, fines, and even prison. Because of this persecution, a group of these separatists decided to leave England altogether. Their first move wasn't to America, but to Holland, a country known for its religious tolerance. They settled in the city of Leiden around 1608. For a while it was okay. They could worship freely without fear of being arrested. But life there was hard. They were outsiders, forced to take low-paying jobs. More importantly, they worried that their children were losing their English identity and culture. They were becoming more Dutch than English, and their strict religious community was starting to fray. They needed a new plan, a place where they could be both English and free to practice their faith as they saw fit. That's when the idea of America started to take hold. The decision to sail to the New World was a huge gamble. They were not wealthy aristocrats. They were weavers, tailors, and farmers. To fund the journey, they had to make a deal with a group of English investors. These investors, called the merchant adventurers, paid for the ship and supplies. In return, the Pilgrims agreed to work for 7 years, sending back resources like fish, fur, and lumber to pay off their debt. This meant their new colony would be as much a business venture as it was a religious sanctuary. Not everyone on the ship was a separatist either. The investors insisted they take other colonists, people they called strangers, who were just looking for economic opportunity. So, the group that set sail was a mix of religious idealists and practical-minded settlers, all crammed together on one small ship. These pilgrims, as we now call them, saw themselves as modern-day Israelites wandering in the wilderness, searching for a promised land. The name Pilgrim comes from a line in one of their journals describing themselves as pilgrims in a spiritual sense. They were on a journey, not just across an ocean, but toward a new society built on their own principles. They were tough, determined, and deeply religious people who were willing to risk everything, their homes, their savings, and their very lives, for a chance to build a community that reflected their vision of a godly life. This combination of religious fervor and sheer grit is what propelled them across the Atlantic and into the pages of American history. The journey to America was an absolute nightmare. The Pilgrims originally had 2 ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. The plan was to sail together, but the Speedwell proved to be a disaster. It kept leaking, forcing them to turn back to England not once but twice. Finally, they had to abandon it. Everyone who was still determined to go, about 102 passengers in total, plus a crew of about 30, crammed onto the Mayflower. Imagine being packed into a space smaller than a modern-day tennis court with 100 other people, plus sailors, animals, and all your worldly possessions, for an unpredictable ocean voyage. The ship finally left Plymouth, England on September 6, 1620, much later in the year than was safe for sailing the stormy North Atlantic. The voyage itself lasted for 66 long, miserable days. The Mayflower was a cargo ship, not a passenger vessel, so there were no cabins or comfortable quarters for the colonists. They lived in the 'tween deck, a dark, cold, and damp space between the main deck and the cargo hold, with a ceiling so low most adults couldn't stand up straight. Seasickness was constant. The food, mostly dried biscuits, hardtack, and salted beef, was monotonous and often infested with worms. Storms were a major threat. One particularly violent storm cracked one of the ship's main beams, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed the Mayflower might break apart in the middle of the ocean. They managed to make a makeshift repair using a large iron screw they had brought with them, but the fear must have been constant. During the crossing, 2 people died, a young servant named William Button, and a sailor. But remarkably, a baby was also born. Elizabeth Hopkins gave birth to a son, whom she appropriately named Oceanus. His birth was a small sign of hope in the midst of so much hardship and uncertainty. The passengers had very little to do but pray, tend to the sick, and try to stay sane in the cramped, foul-smelling conditions. They were at the mercy of the wind and the waves, sailing toward a destination they had only read about in books and pamphlets. Their intended destination was the mouth of the Hudson River, in what was then the northern part of the Virginia colony. But the late start and the fierce autumn storms blew them far off course. On November 9, 1620, after more than 2 months at sea, they finally spotted land. It was the coast of what is now Cape Cod, Massachusetts, hundreds of miles north of where they were supposed to be. The relief must have been incredible, but their problems were far from over. They were in an unknown territory with no English charter to settle there. Winter was coming on fast, and they were running desperately low on supplies, especially beer, which was safer to drink than the stored water. They spent the next month exploring the coast, looking for a suitable place to build their new home. Finally, on December 21st, they chose a site that had a good harbor, fresh water, and cleared fields. They named it Plymouth, after the last port they had left in England. This is where Plymouth Rock enters the story, or at least, the legend. The popular image that has been painted in countless school plays and artworks is of the Pilgrims, led by men in black hats with buckled shoes, stepping triumphantly from a small boat onto this specific rock. It's a powerful image, suggesting a firm, solid first step in a new land, the beginning of a new nation. The rock serves as a symbolic threshold between the old world and the new, a piece of American soil that welcomed the founders of the colony. This single moment of contact between foot and stone has become one of the most enduring foundation myths in American history, a scene that every school child learns. However, there's a rather large problem with this story. There is absolutely no historical proof that it ever happened. Not a single one of the Pilgrims' own accounts of their arrival mentions landing on a rock. The two primary sources we have from the Pilgrims themselves are William Bradford's Journal of Plymouth Plantation and a book called Mort's Relation, written by Bradford and Edward Winslow. Both give detailed descriptions of their explorations and their final decision to settle at Plymouth. They talk about the weather, the landscape, and their first encounters with the native people. But a rock? Not a word. The story of the landing on Plymouth Rock doesn't appear in any written record for 121 years. The tale first surfaced in 1741, more than a century after the Mayflower arrived. The town of Plymouth was planning to build a wharf that would have covered the rock. An elderly man, a 94-year-old church elder named Thomas Faunce, heard about this and became very upset. He asked to be carried down to the shore one last time. There, surrounded by townspeople, he tearfully identified the boulder as the exact spot where the Pilgrims had first set foot. Faunce claimed that his father, who had arrived in Plymouth a few years after the Mayflower, had pointed out the rock to him as a boy and told him the story. Because Elder Faunce was a respected figure, his story stuck. People wanted to believe it, and so they did. From that day forward, Plymouth Rock became an object of veneration. It was the physical proof of the Pilgrim's story, a sacred relic. The story was just too good to check. It provided a tangible focal point for a national origin story that was still taking shape. It was easier to rally around a rock than around a vague historical concept. The legend grew and was embellished over time, becoming an essential part of America's patriotic folklore. So, while the image of the Pilgrims landing on the rock is powerful and deeply ingrained in the culture, it's almost certainly a piece of historical fiction. It's a tradition, a legend passed down, not a documented fact from the people who were actually there. The history of Plymouth Rock, after it became famous, is almost as dramatic as the Pilgrim's journey itself. For a rock, it has certainly had a lot of adventures, and most of them were not good for its health. Its troubles began during the build-up to the American Revolution. In 1774, some of the more patriotic citizens of Plymouth decided that the rock should be moved from the shore to a more prominent place in the town square, next to a newly raised Liberty Pole. They saw it as a powerful symbol of the colonists' original quest for freedom from English tyranny. So, they gathered a team of about 30 oxen to haul the massive stone. But the rock had other ideas. As they tried to lift it from its sandy bed, it accidentally split in two. This crack-up was seen not as a disaster, but as a divine sign. The Patriots decided to leave the bottom half of the rock where it was, embedded in the shoreline. They triumphantly paraded the upper piece through the town and placed it in front of the meeting house. For the next several decades, the two halves of Plymouth Rock lived separate lives. The upper chunk was a celebrated icon of liberty, while the bottom half remained half buried in the mud and water of the harbor, slowly being worn away by the tides and chipped at by souvenir hunters. The top piece was moved again in 1834 to a new, more elegant spot in front of Pilgrim Hall Museum, where it was enclosed by a fancy iron fence. It was a tourist attraction, but it was only half the story. By the 1860s, people started to think that maybe the rock should be put back together. It seemed a bit sad to have this national symbol broken in two, so in 1880, the town decided to reunite the two halves. The upper piece was moved back down to the waterfront and cemented to its long-lost base. It was during this reunion that the date 1620 was carved into its surface, making its historical claim official for all to see. The newly repaired rock was now whole again, but the scar from its 106-year separation was clearly visible. The cement used to patch it together was a permanent reminder of its strange and difficult journey through American history. Finally, in 1920, to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the Pilgrims' arrival, the rock got its current, very grand home. The entire waterfront was redesigned, and the rock was moved a final time, just a few yards thankfully, to its present location at sea level. The elegant Roman-style portico was built over it to protect it from the weather and from the public. Today, it rests there, a patched-up, scarred, but ultimately enduring symbol. Its journey of being moved, broken, celebrated, and reassembled is a story in itself, a metaphor for a nation that has often been divided, but has always strived to come back together. Before a single pilgrim set foot on the shore of Plymouth, they did something truly revolutionary. They wrote a document. This wasn't just any document, it was the Mayflower Compact. The reason for it was simple. they had a problem. As you'll recall, they had landed far north of their intended destination in Virginia. This meant their official patent, their legal permission to settle, was useless. They were in a lawless land with no government to command them. Some of the strangers on board, the non-separatists, started making discontented and mutinous speeches, arguing that since they weren't in Virginia, no one had the power to tell them what to do. The Pilgrim leaders knew that they needed to establish some form of order before anyone even left the ship, or their new colony would collapse into chaos. So, on November 11, 1620, while the Mayflower was anchored in what is now Provincetown Harbor, 41 of the adult male colonists gathered to draft an agreement. The Mayflower Compact was surprisingly short and to the point. In it, the signers declared their loyalty to King James of England, but they also declared that they were forming a civil body politic. This meant they were creating their own government. They promised to work together to enact just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices for the general good of the colony. Most importantly, they all agreed to promise all due submission and obedience to the laws they would create for themselves. It was a radical idea for its time. This compact was not a constitution in the modern sense. It didn't lay out a detailed structure for a government or a Bill of Rights. But its importance cannot be overstated. It was the first document in what would become the United States that established the principle of self-government based on the consent of the governed. The colonists were not being ruled by a distant king or a royal governor, they were agreeing to rule themselves. They were creating a government from the ground up, based on a social contract among themselves. This idea, that political authority comes from the people themselves, would become a cornerstone of American democracy over a century and a half later. The Mayflower Compact was a pragmatic solution to an immediate crisis, but its legacy is immense. It showed that a group of ordinary people could come together and agree to live under a system of laws that they themselves created. It established a precedent for town meetings and local government that would become characteristic of New England. While the Pilgrims were seeking religious freedom, they ended up planting the seeds of political freedom as well. This short, simple agreement, written out of necessity on a cramped ship in a cold harbor, is one of the most important founding documents in American history, a testament to the Pilgrims' belief in order, community, and self-determination. The Pilgrims did not arrive in an empty land. The area they chose for their Plymouth settlement had been the site of a Wampanoag village called Patuxet. The Wampanoag people had lived in the region for thousands of years. They had a complex society, a rich culture, and deep knowledge of the land. But just a few years before the Pilgrims arrived, from about 1616 to 1619, a terrible epidemic, likely a disease brought by earlier European traders, had swept through the coastal tribes. The plague wiped out an estimated 90% of the Wampanoag population in the Patuxet area. This is why the Pilgrims found cleared fields and a convenient place to settle. They were building their new home on the site of a recent tragedy. The first winter was devastating for the colonists as well. Sickness and starvation were rampant, and by the spring of 1621, half of the 102 Mayflower passengers were dead. In March 1621, as the surviving Pilgrims were struggling to hold on, they had a startling encounter. A Native American man walked boldly into their settlement and greeted them in English. His name was Samoset, and he was a leader from a tribe in Maine. He had learned some English from fishermen and traders. A few days later he returned with another man, Squanto, whose story was even more incredible. Squanto, also known as Tisquantum, was a member of the Patuxet Band, the very people who had lived where the Pilgrims were now settled. He had been kidnapped by an English explorer in 1614 and taken to Spain to be sold into slavery. He eventually made his way to England, learned English, and finally managed to get passage back to his homeland in 1619, only to find that his entire village had been wiped out by the plague. Squanto, finding himself alone, became an indispensable bridge between the Pilgrims and the local Wampanoag leader, a powerful sachem named Massasoit. He acted as an interpreter and a guide, teaching the struggling colonists how to survive in their new environment. He showed them how to plant corn, using fish as fertilizer, a skill that was crucial for their survival. He taught them where to fish and how to hunt for beaver. He helped them navigate the complex relationships with other native tribes in the area. Without Squanto's help, it is almost certain that the Plymouth colony would have failed. He was, as Governor William Bradford wrote, a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. Thanks to Squanto's diplomacy, the Pilgrims and Massasoit's Wampanoag people formed an alliance. In the spring of 1621, they signed a peace treaty, promising mutual support and defense. This alliance was politically useful for both sides. Massasoit, whose people had been weakened by the epidemic, needed allies against his powerful rivals, the Narragansett tribe. The Pilgrims, weak and vastly outnumbered, desperately needed peace and assistance to survive. This crucial relationship, brokered by the remarkable Squanto, allowed the Plymouth colony to get a foothold in the New World and set the stage for one of the most famous meals in American history. After that brutal first winter, the Pilgrims' fortunes began to turn around in the autumn of 1621. Thanks to the guidance of Squanto and the hard work of the survivors, their first harvest was a success. They had gathered enough corn and other vegetables to see them through the coming winter. Governor William Bradford, feeling grateful for their survival and their modest bounty, declared a harvest celebration to give thanks. This event, which lasted for 3 days, is what we now remember as the first Thanksgiving. It was a moment of relief and optimism after a year of profound suffering and loss. The colonists were finally on stable ground, with food in their storehouses and a peaceful relationship with their neighbors. The feast itself was likely very different from the holiday we celebrate today. The Pilgrims didn't call it Thanksgiving. To them, a day of Thanksgiving was a solemn religious observance of prayer and fasting, not a feast. This was simply a harvest festival, a traditional English celebration. And they didn't eat turkey, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. The historical accounts mention that the Pilgrims sent 4 men out fowling, so they likely had wild birds like ducks, geese, and possibly wild turkey. The Wampanoag guests brought 5 deer as a contribution to the meal. Other likely dishes included fish, eels, shellfish, corn, squash, and beans. It was a true feast, a combination of English and Native American foods. The Wampanoag were not originally on the guest list. According to the primary account from Edward Winslow, about 90 Wampanoag men, including their leader Massasoit, showed up at the Plymouth settlement. Their arrival might have been a surprise to the colonists. Some historians think they heard the celebratory gunfire from the Pilgrims' fowling expedition and came to see what the commotion was about, perhaps fearing an attack. But when they saw it was a celebration, they joined in, contributing their deer to the feast. For 3 days, the roughly 50 surviving Pilgrims and their 90 Wampanoag guests ate, played games, and demonstrated their skills with bows and muskets. It was a remarkable moment of cross-cultural harmony. This peaceful gathering, however, was not the beginning of a long and happy relationship between European settlers and Native Americans. It was a temporary moment of cooperation born of mutual need. Within a generation, the fragile peace between the colonists and the Wampanoag would shatter, leading to brutal conflicts like King Philip's War. The story of the first Thanksgiving is often romanticized, glossing over the tensions and the tragic history that would follow. But it remains a powerful symbol in the American imagination, a symbol of gratitude, community, and the hope that different cultures can come together to share the bounty of the land in peace, even if that hope proved to be short-lived. Today, Plymouth Rock stands as one of America's most potent symbols. It represents much more than a potential landing spot. For millions of people, it is the embodiment of courage, faith, and the search for freedom. It is seen as the starting point of the American experiment, a physical touchstone for the ideals of religious liberty and self-government. The story of the Pilgrims' perilous journey and their struggle to build a new society has become a foundational myth, and the rock is its anchor. It symbolizes the immigrant experience, the act of leaving an old world behind to start anew in a land of promise. Every year, countless visitors stand before it, reflecting on the sacrifices of those early colonists and the nation they helped to create. However, many historians and cultural critics view the rock with a healthy dose of skepticism. They point out correctly that the story of the landing is a legend, not a fact. They argue that the immense focus on Plymouth Rock and the Pilgrims distorts the true history of America's origins. It presents a sanitized and simplified version of events, one that often ignores the complex and often violent interactions between European colonists and Native American populations. The story of the Pilgrims is just one of many arrival stories. The Spanish were in Florida and the Southwest long before 1620, and the English had already established a colony at Jamestown in 1607. To treat Plymouth Rock as the nation's single starting point is to ignore a much larger and more complicated picture. For many Native Americans, particularly the Wampanoag, Plymouth Rock is not a symbol of freedom and new beginnings. Instead, it represents the arrival of colonists who would ultimately displace their people, seize their lands, and destroy their way of life. Since 1970, many Native Americans and their supporters have gathered at Plymouth Rock on Thanksgiving Day for a national day of mourning. It is a protest against the celebratory myths surrounding the Pilgrims and a solemn remembrance of the suffering, genocide, and injustice that their ancestors endured as a result of European colonization. For them, the Rock is a painful reminder of a history of loss and betrayal, a history that is often erased from the popular Thanksgiving narrative. Ultimately, the meaning of Plymouth Rock depends on who is telling the story. It is a symbol that holds conflicting truths. It can represent both a courageous quest for freedom and the beginning of a devastating invasion. Its importance lies not in whether the Pilgrims actually stepped on it, but in the powerful ideas and contested histories that have been projected onto it for nearly 3 centuries. It forces us to confront the complexities of our national identity, to acknowledge both the celebrated ideals and the painful realities of our past. Plymouth Rock is more than just a stone. It is a cultural battleground, a humble boulder that carries the immense weight of America's dreams, contradictions, and ongoing arguments about who we are and where we came from.
Ready for a history adventure? Join our community. Subscribe to World History, smash that like, share with friends, and drop your thoughts below. Let's make history together. See you in the comments.